As World War II got underway, both the Allies and the Germans were looking for the knockout blow, the new weapon that would decisively defeat the enemy. For Hitler's Germany, the problem was that Britain was an island. His tanks couldn't blitzkrieg across the Channel. The only way to defeat her was to strangle her sea-borne supply routes. That meant warships, and above all, submarines. For the Western Allies, the problem was attacking Germany when there were no Allied troops in mainland Europe. The solution they adopted was strategic bombing. Aerial bombardment aimed at destroying Germany's infrastructure and pounding its people into submission. The two sides had adopted two very different tactics, but with one aim: to save their troops and to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible. Ironically, it was the Germans who first started strategic bombing. In August 1940, Luftwaffe bombers accidentally hit London. The RAF retaliated by bombing Berlin. By the autumn, Germany was bombing Britain's cities almost daily, convinced the British would eventually crack. But the Blitz, as it was called, never showed any sign of forcing the British to surrender. And by the summer of 1941, it was dying away as the Luftwaffe turned its attention to the war in Russia. But for the British military command, bombing remained the only way of striking directly at Hitler's Germany. Moreover, by early 1941, the RAF was starting to receive a new generation of bigger, more powerful, four-engined bombers. These could carry loads of up to 18,000 pounds of bombs, 4 times the capacity of earlier aircraft. The first of these was the Short Stirling. To begin with, the plan was not to hit the German population, but specific infrastructure targets, cutting transport and oil supplies, damaging Germany's ability to wage war. But it suffered one central problem. Britain's bombing was extremely inaccurate. In August 1941, a secret British report showed that over the crucial German Ruhr industrial area, only 10% of British bombers were getting their bombs within 5 miles of their target. At the same time, the German air defenses were taking a terrible toll on British planes. By late 1941, up to 10% of the bombers on any raid were being shot down. A loss rate which couldn't be sustained. The Royal Air Force High Command decided to change tactics. It gave up any pretense of trying to hit specific targets. Instead, Bomber Command was instructed to undertake what it called area bombing, a euphemism for what is known today as carpet bombing. The idea was to deliberately target an entire area of a city, regardless of the civilian population. In the chilling words of the British Air Ministry, it would destroy the morale of the civilian population and, in particular, of industrial workers. Its leading exponent was Air Marshal Sir Arthur "Bomber" Harris, who was now appointed Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command.
There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
In spring 1942, Harris launched what was, in effect, a huge public relations stunt for what he preferred to call strategic bombing. He gathered every available aircraft in Bomber Command. Over 1,000 took off for the German city of Cologne. The city's defenses were overwhelmed. 600 acres were destroyed. But only 39 British aircraft were lost. Harris had won his point. He now had the full support of the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He also now had an outstanding new weapon, the Avro Lancaster, the finest heavy night bomber of the war. And he had a new partner. By the summer of 1942, the United States had joined the air war in Europe. American planes began to appear in Britain. The majority were the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It was heavily armed with 13 machine guns and could, in theory, fight its way through to a target in daylight without a fighter escort. It was also equipped with a new bomb sight that would supposedly allow it to drop its bombs with almost unerring precision. These features encouraged the Americans to ignore the lessons of the early British campaign and return to targeted raids on Germany's infrastructure. In August 1942, the Americans put the Flying Fortress to the test. 12 of them attacked marshalling yards near Rouen in France. Damage was slight, but the United States lost no aircraft. For the Americans, it was the proof that daylight raids on infrastructure targets could work. For the British, it simply showed that the Americans could hit a minor and relatively undefended target. But that winter, the two allies agreed to combine their approaches. They would launch a massive bombing campaign against Germany's industrial heartland. The Americans would attack by day against carefully selected infrastructure targets. The British would attack by night, carpet bombing whole areas, destroying war production and civilian morale. They hoped it would be so devastating, it might even bring the war to an end. In March 1943, British planes took off for the German industrial city of Essen. High-speed Mosquito light bombers went in first, dropping flares to highlight the targets. Then a force of nearly 450 Lancaster bombers swept over the city, dropping their loads. The German defenses were overpowered. Only 14 British aircraft were shot down. The Essen raid was followed by wave after wave of similar attacks on industrial towns in the Ruhr. But the German air defenses now began to get the measure of the Allied attacks. Britain's losses climbed to 1 in 10. Harris was forced, reluctantly, to call a halt to the attacks. But then he was informed about a new Allied invention. Codenamed Window, it consisted of clouds of aluminium foil strips dropped from an aircraft. As the foil fell, it jammed any radar system. It promised to cripple the German air defenses. Harris seized on it. And 4 months after the Essen raid, in July 1943, he went back on the offensive. He called it Operation Gomorrah. The target this time was the industrial port of Hamburg. Bombers equipped with Window jammed the German radar. Other aircraft dropped incendiary bombs. A giant firestorm engulfed the city center. "40,000 people died, and 500,000 were made homeless. More raids on the port followed. It was an enormous shock to the German people. Four months later, in the autumn of 1943, Harris followed Hamburg with a series of attacks on Berlin. But by now, the Germans were learning to overcome the effect of Window, and by spring 1944, British losses were back at nearly 1 plane in 10. Worse, there was no sign German civilian morale was cracking. Harris's carpet bombing campaign was just not working. But neither was the American alternative of targeting infrastructure. By the spring of 1943, US Army Air Force daylight raids were steadily reaching deeper into Germany. But American losses were climbing. Around 1 in every 15 planes was being shot down. Yet undaunted, the American command now launched an attack on factories in the German towns of Regensburg and Schweinfurt. It was hugely ambitious. Both were deep in southern Germany, far beyond the range of US escort fighters. It was a disaster. The 380 flying fortresses, which US bomber chiefs had assured everybody wouldn't need a fighter escort, were harried and shot down. The loss rate was over 16%. The US was forced to suspend its bombing campaign. The war in the air had reached stalemate, and there was still no sign of it helping to usher in a victory. Then, in the early summer of 1944, as the Allies prepared to invade mainland Europe, the British and American air forces were tasked with disrupting German communication lines and oil supplies. It represented a return to targeted infrastructure bombing. But this time, the Allies had a new weapon. The British had experimentally modified a US fighter, the P-51 Mustang. The US engine had been replaced by a British-made Rolls-Royce Merlin. It gave the plane a much longer range. It was the ideal long-distance bomber escort. The Allied bombers hit bridges and roads leading to the German front in France with almost surgical precision. Oil supplies to the German military were drastically reduced. Once again, the German fighters attacked, but they were now outmaneuvered by the Mustang. Much of the German Air Force, now running low on fuel, was grounded. The campaign of targeted bombing on Germany's infrastructure may not have been the knockout blow the Allies hoped for, but it was finally paying dividends. But one man was not impressed. Bomber Harris was still obsessed with the idea that ever more devastating carpet bombing attacks would stop Germany in her tracks once and for all. So it was that in late 1944, Britain returned to carpet bombing. German city after city was hit and devastated. Then, in February 1945, Harris attacked Dresden, a city with virtually no military significance. The city's civilian population had been inflated by refugees fleeing bombing raids elsewhere. Yet Harris seems to have had no regard for civilian life. The city was flattened. Some 50,000 people died. It was a raid too far. Finally, questions began to be asked about the morality, let alone the efficacy, of carpet bombing. Whatever it had achieved, it had been done at an horrendous cost of civilian and military lives. Critically, it had failed to break German morale, yet 60% of RAF crews had died before they had completed 30 missions. For all the hopes put in it, carpet bombing had not come up with the knockout blow. The Germans, meanwhile, had put their faith in an altogether different technology to give them the knockout blow they needed to win the war. For Germany, Britain was a problem. It was an island, and for once Hitler's formidable land forces were useless. Britain also had a much more powerful navy. Yet Hitler calculated that if he used what he had strategically, he could fatally disrupt the sea convoys that were keeping Britain supplied with everything from oil to food. In the first 18 months of the war, German raiders sank more than 130 British merchant vessels. Some of the most effective raiders were the so-called pocket battleships, small but powerful warships designed in the 1930s to circumvent restrictions imposed on German rearmament after World War I. One, the Graf Spee, became particularly notorious. In a matter of weeks, she sank 9 Allied merchant ships in the South Atlantic before being cornered off the River Plate in South America and Scotland. But the raids were taking a serious toll. If the losses continued to rise, Britain would have real supply problems. Then, in early spring 1941, Germany's first and only 2 full-sized battleships completed their sea trials. They sent a shiver through the British Navy. Their potential for destruction was enormous. First into action was the Bismarck. In May, RAF reconnaissance aircraft spotted her in the Norwegian port of Bergen, trying to sneak out into the North Atlantic. The British Navy set off in pursuit. 2 days later, the Bismarck was sighted in the North Atlantic. Britain's latest battleship, the Prince of Wales, was sent to intercept her. With her was the British battlecruiser, Hood. Early on May the 24th, 1941, the 2 forces met. It was the first time the 2 sides' battleships had squared up to each other. Almost immediately, a shell from the Bismarck plunged through the weak deck armor of the Hood. It penetrated one of the aft magazines. There was a huge explosion. Only 3 of the Hood's 1,200 crew survived. The Prince of Wales, now outnumbered, retreated. It was round 1 to the Bismarck. 2 days later, Bismarck was spotted again, this time far to the south, several hundred miles off the coast of France. British Swordfish torpedo bombers swooped in. One hit and jammed the Bismarck's rudder. The following morning, 2 British battleships, the Rodney and King George V, caught up with the crippled Bismarck. They started pouring heavy caliber shells onto the hapless German ship. She was soon reduced to a blazing wreck. Bismarck was finally sunk by a torpedo. All but 110 of her 2,300 crew perished. The Bismarck had been sunk before she'd had a chance to prove her worth. Then, in June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The war at sea entered a new phase. Britain began sending supply convoys to the Russian Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel. Immediately, the German Navy prepared to cut them off. Convoy after convoy was attacked or threatened. By summer 1943, it had become so dangerous, further convoys to Russia were suspended until the autumn, when it was hoped bad weather and poor visibility would offer some protection. While the convoys were suspended, Britain turned its attention to one of the biggest threats it faced, the Bismarck's sister ship, Tirpitz. She'd spent months hiding in the Norwegian fjords, waiting for the moment to pounce. All the while, the British Navy had been keeping her under close watch, determined to eliminate Germany's last battleship. In September 1943, 5 British midget submarines known as X-craft were sent into the Norwegian fjords to sink her. The attack caused only minor damage. By the following spring, the Tirpitz was once again ready to menace the Arctic convoys. The Royal Navy now sent in a massive force to attack her. It included 6 aircraft carriers. They took the Germans completely by surprise. British dive bombers attacked Tirpitz. But she was heavily armored, and the relatively small bombs caused only superficial damage. 3 months later, she was ready for action again. She was soon spotted in another Norwegian fjord. Lancaster bombers carrying massive 5-ton tallboy bombs were sent in to sink her once and for all. Tirpitz put up a smokescreen, which partially obscured her. Nevertheless, several bombs struck her bow, causing severe damage. Finally, 2 months later, a squadron of Lancaster bombers caught her in perfect weather conditions. 3 tall boys struck home. Tirpitz slowly capsized. Almost 1,000 crew members went down with her. After more than 2 years of hiding and running from the British Navy, she had been sunk. Germany's battleships had promised much, but against the overwhelming might of the British Navy, they'd never had a chance to prove their worth. Hitler had lost the battle at sea, at least on the surface. But below the waves, it was a different story. Germany's military planners had long expected that the country's U-boat fleet would play a key role in cutting Britain's supply lines. They could sneak up underwater on British merchant vessels, attacking them at the last moment. The submarines were also extremely agile on the surface. To combat the threat, Britain's merchant fleet was corralled into convoys for protection. But there was a serious shortage of anti-submarine ships to escort them. Many ships sailed without protection. Yet Britain's naval command remained remarkably complacent. They believed they had the weapons and the technology to contain the U-boat threat. It was soon proved wrong. In the early months of the war, Britain's supply lines were harassed and disrupted. Often the U-boats would attack on the surface, picking off merchant ships with their deck guns. In response, the Royal Navy sent aircraft carriers equipped with submarine hunting aircraft to patrol the sea lanes used by the convoys. But they had only limited effect. By the end of 1939, over 100 Allied merchant ships had been sunk by German submarines. If losses continued at this rate, Britain would face disaster. Oil, food, and weapons would all begin to run short. Then things got even more difficult. Germany overran France. Suddenly, the German Navy, which until now had been largely bottled up in the North Sea, had access to France's Atlantic seaboard. They now had a base to attack Britain's Atlantic convoys. France's Atlantic ports filled with newly built German U-boats, particularly the Type 7C ocean-going vessel. Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the German U-boat service, now organized his submarines into what he called wolf packs. A group would be lined up across a likely convoy route. As soon as one U-boat spotted a convoy, it called in the rest to attack. Sometimes the U-boats were also guided by long-range patrol aircraft. By the end of October 1940, up to 40% of Allied merchant shipping per convoy was being sunk. Britain's supplies were under threat. German U-boat crews called it the happy time, and top U-boat commanders became national heroes. Britain was paying dearly for its lack of preparation. But finally, things began to change. A crash-building program of anti-submarine escort vessels was producing results. The first corvettes, as they were known, were coming off the slipways. For the first time, Britain could set up permanent groups of warships to escort the supply convoys. But their effectiveness was limited by the fact that their top speed was 15 knots, 2 knots slower than the surface speed of a U-boat. At the same time, the patrol aircraft of Britain's coastal command were equipped with depth charges. They lacked the range to cover the mid-Atlantic, but U-boats on the surface near their bases could be harried and forced to submerge. Then, as in the bombing campaigns, it was a series of technological breakthroughs that really came to Britain's help. In early 1940, a new type of radar, known as centimetric radar, was developed. It was smaller than existing systems, and for the first time could be fitted to escort ships and aircraft. Now, any German U-boat on the surface was vulnerable. Some months later, there was a second technological breakthrough. Huff-Duff was a radio detector. Anytime a German U-boat surfaced to communicate, Huff-Duff could pick up the radio signal and pinpoint its exact position. Steadily, during the spring of 1941, Britain began to contain the U-boat threat. Merchant shipping losses fell by more than half. In early March, Günther Prien, one of Germany's top U-boat commanders, failed to return from a patrol. Shortly afterwards, 2 more top German U-boat commanders lost their lives in quick succession. Then Germany suffered a major disaster that would reverberate through the rest of the war. In May 1941, the British destroyer Bulldog forced U-110 to the surface and captured the submarine. On board was an Enigma machine used for encoding German signals. More importantly, Bulldog also captured the naval code books that went with the machine. It would provide vital assistance to Britain's code breakers. Soon, unbeknown to the Germans, Britain was getting a real insight into German naval communications. For the Royal Navy, it meant convoys could now be routed away from the U-boat wolfpacks. Germany's submarines had to work harder and search further to find and sink their prey. Yet, despite the Allied gains, by the winter of 1941, the German war machine was producing ever greater numbers of U-boats. The long-term outlook for Britain's supply routes still looked ominous. Then, in December 1941, the war at sea changed decisively. In December 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States. Almost immediately, Admiral Dönitz, head of the German U-boat service, sent submarines to attack US merchant shipping along the American seaboard. At first, only a few of his submarines, the new Type 9, were capable of making the long voyage from Europe. They found easy pickings. The US Navy's Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Ernest King, had resisted British advice to corral his merchant ships into convoys. Over a 3-month period, more than 400 US merchant ships were sunk or destroyed. America was learning the tough lesson Britain had already learnt. Something had to be done. King now changed his mind, and by May 1942, the United States had introduced a limited system of convoys. By July, the US losses were falling. It forced the Germans to adopt a new tactic. They would concentrate their U-boats in one particular part of the North Atlantic, the Black Gap, the area in mid-ocean too far from land for anti-submarine aircraft to reach. Often a convoy would be hit by more than 15 submarines coming at it in waves. During October 1942, 56 Allied ships were sunk in the Black Gap. By the following March, Allied losses had reached 120 ships in a single month. During the same month, the Germans lost only 12 U-boats. Hitler's tactic of disrupting Britain's supply lines so severely the country would collapse seemed a real possibility. It looked as though his U-boats might win him the war. But now the Allies began to up their game. Britain had brought in a new commander. Admiral Max Horton was former head of the Royal Navy's submarine fleet. His first move was to set up permanent groups of destroyers and frigates that would provide additional support to convoys, rushing in as soon as an enemy wolfpack was spotted. Equally importantly, a string of yet more technological developments came on stream. The Hedgehog was an anti-submarine mortar that fired 24 bombs. Allied aircraft were fitted with a new high-powered searchlight, the Lee light. As an aircraft swooped in, it could be turned on at the last moment, catching a submarine by surprise on the surface. The steady technological advance now began to pay off. The German U-boat losses increased. The German commander, Admiral Dönitz, struggled to regain the initiative. In April, he ordered an all-out U-boat attack on convoy ONS-5, a convoy of 43 merchant ships traveling from Liverpool to Canada. It was designed to be a demonstration of German naval force. 40 U-boats descended on the convoy. The British sent in extra support groups. Anti-submarine aircraft flew from Canada. It would take 4 days for the Allies to beat off the German attack. 11 merchant ships were sunk, but the Germans had lost 7 U-boats. Two weeks later, Dönitz tried again, attacking a second convoy. It was a disaster. 5 U-boats were sunk without a single merchant ship being lost. During May 1943, a quarter of all Germany's operational U-boats was sunk. The Germans were finally beginning to lose the U-boat war in the Atlantic. So the Allies now took the battle to the Germans. A new long-range version of the US B-24 Liberator bomber was introduced. It could now reach the German U-boats in the Black Gap. Germany's submarine designers tried to respond with innovations of their own. U-boats were fitted with radar detectors and anti-aircraft guns. Some were also fitted with the Dutch-designed schnorkel, an air inlet that meant that submarines could spend longer underwater, hidden from Allied radar. But it was too little, too late. The Allies still found them. Hitler's U-boats were now pinned down in port. It was too dangerous for them to roam the ocean freely. German attempts to find an answer became increasingly desperate. They now produced a revolutionary new submarine. It was known as the Type 21. It was electric-powered and capable of 17 knots while submerged, over twice the speed of a traditional submarine and fast enough to outrun most surface vessels. But again, it was too late. Only one ever became operational, and it never made contact with the enemy. By the end of 1943, the Allies dominated the Atlantic. It was a turning point in the war. Hitler's U-boat campaign had taken a terrible toll on both sides. The Germans lost nearly 800 submarines. 75% of the U-boat crews perished. On the Allied side, some 32,000 sailors died. But now, at last, with the U-boats out of the way, great waves of US troops and equipment could flood across the ocean in preparation for the invasion of Europe. Victory in the Battle of the Atlantic would fundamentally change the course of the war. summer 1943, and on the Eastern Front, Hitler's armies were in retreat. Huge Soviet artillery barrages and tank assaults were shredding the German lines. Hitler, by now, was fighting a war on two fronts. In Western Europe, an Anglo-American force was moving up through Italy, menacing his southern flank. The Germans had been forced to pull some of their elite troops back from the Eastern Front to help. It left their forces in the east dangerously overstretched. The exhausted German soldiers were up against the enormous reserves of the huge Soviet military machine. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, now seized this opportunity to wreak his revenge and move onto the offensive. By early August 1943, the Red Army had driven the Germans from the cities of Orel and Belgorod. To celebrate the victories, Stalin ordered 12 124-gun salvos and a barrage of fireworks in Moscow's Red Square. He proclaimed, "Eternal glory to the heroes who fell in the struggle for freedom. Death to the German invaders." In Germany, Hitler's response was to take greater personal control of all important military decisions. The effects were felt almost immediately by Axis troops occupying the strategically important city of Kharkov. The Soviet forces approached the city from three sides. The German commander, Erich von Manstein, ordered a tactical withdrawal. Hitler immediately countermanded it. Kharkov should be held at all costs. Hitler would not accept anything that would reduce what he called Lebensraum, the land he believed Germany needed to ensure its greatness. Just as importantly, he also believed Germany would win the war, if not by numbers, then by the sheer will to win. The Germans dug in. At first, it seemed to work. For several days, repeated Soviet assaults were repulsed. More than 300 Russian T-34 tanks were destroyed. But by the end of August 1943, the German positions had been overrun. Eventually, Manstein went against his Führer. He ordered his men to get out. The Red Army drove into the ruins of Kharkov the next day. It marked the beginning of a massive Soviet offensive along a 1,500-mile front. It stretched from Rostov in the south to Smolensk in the north. At the southern end of the front, near Rostov, a Russian breakthrough threatened to trap pockets of German soldiers in the Crimea. Once again, Manstein asked permission to withdraw. All he got was a message from Hitler. "Don't do anything. I am coming myself." But he never did. The German military was forced into another last-minute, chaotic retreat. The withdrawal was made worse by bands of battle-hardened partisans. Many were former Red Army soldiers who had been cut off behind enemy lines. They now ambushed the retreating Germans, cutting their communication and supply lines. The Germans responded with predictable ferocity. There were savage reprisals against the civilian population. The Germans also launched a scorched earth policy. Factories, power plants, railways and bridges were all blown up. A massive hydroelectric dam, which provided electricity for the whole of the Ukraine, was wrecked. Meanwhile, in the center of the front, the Germans fell back across the river Dnieper. As they fled, they blew up yet more bridges, turning the river into a formidable defensive line. They then dug in along the west bank. Stalin's response was to offer the Soviet Union's highest award to the first Red Army soldier to cross the river. By the early autumn 1943, a number of small Soviet bridgeheads had been established on the German-controlled West Bank. But they met determined German resistance. Fighting raged along the Dnieper throughout October 1943. Finally, at the beginning of November, Soviet troops captured Kiev. All along the river, the Germans were pushed out of their defensive positions and forced to retreat still further west. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had virtually cleared the Germans out of Russia's historic homeland. They were now moving west across the Ukraine. The countries of Europe were in their sights. By spring 1944, Hitler's armies were in full retreat. The Soviet leadership now poured in ever greater quantities of men and equipment. The Germans had two excellent tanks, the Tiger I and the Panzer Mark V Panther. Both were well suited to the sort of mobile defensive warfare which was the only remaining hope for the German armies on the Eastern Front. But the Red Army had at least twice as many tanks, mostly the battle-tried T-34, and armament factories in Siberia were turning out more at a rate of 2,000 a month. While Hitler was forced to divide his forces between a war on two fronts, Stalin's war machine was working flat out. 6 million Soviet troops faced less than 3 million Germans. In early January 1944, the forces of the First Ukrainian Front moved in from the north on the German-held town of Korsun. It was the last German toehold on what they'd hoped would be their defensive line along the river Dnieper. 12 days later, the forces of the Second Ukrainian Front drove forward on the southern side. The attack followed a by now well-established Soviet pattern. First, there was a build-up of an overwhelming number of troops. The Germans were never quite sure where the first assault would come from. Then there was a devastating artillery bombardment. Next, the massed tanks of the Red Army would punch a hole through the German defenses. Finally, the infantry poured in. In Korsun, it quickly became obvious to the Germans they were about to be overwhelmed. The German commander, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to beg, yet again, for permission to pull out. But Hitler once more refused. After a week of fierce fighting, about 60,000 men were trapped in what became known as the Korsun pocket. The Soviets called it Little Stalingrad. The German forces now attempted to break out. But the Russians were ready for it. T-34 tanks and Cossack horsemen harried the Germans as they tried to escape. The fighting lasted 2 days. By the time Korsun fell, the Germans had lost some 30,000 men. The Red Army forces were now moving forward at speed. Their advance was made possible by fleets of trucks, mostly provided by the United States, that kept their forces supplied. It was a much faster process than for the Germans, who still relied heavily on horses. The Russians were also dominating the skies. The Luftwaffe had always been a key part of the German war machine. But Hitler had been forced to divert many of his aircraft to defend the homeland from a US and British bomber offensive. As a result, Russian planes outnumbered the Luftwaffe 5-1. The Red Air Force's Sturmwik fighter bombers took a heavy toll on German armor and supply columns. Yet Hitler refused to contemplate defeat, and now announced a new version of his no-retreat policy. He ordered the German troops to create what he called fortified areas, or local strongholds. These were to be defended to the bitter end. Only with his personal approval could any of these fortresses be abandoned. It was a desperate ploy, and would come to cost the Germans dearly. One of the first tests of the new strategy was near the Ukrainian town of Kamenets-Podolsky. Here, 20 divisions of panzers were threatened with being cut off. But Hitler declared it a fortified area and refused to allow a retreat. In the face of bitter fighting, there was a vitriolic argument between Hitler and Manstein, who could see the writing on the wall. Finally, Manstein got his way, and the panzers were given permission to break out. Ten days later, some 200,000 men of the 1st Panzer Army safely reached the German lines over 100 miles to the west. But they had lost most of their heavy equipment and weapons. By now, Manstein's requests to retreat had become too much for Hitler. The field marshal was sacked. Further south, the Germans attempted to hold back the Soviet torrent on the Yezhny Bug River. They failed, and a large force of Germans was caught behind Russian lines in the Black Sea port of Odessa. They too faced being cut off. In early April 1944, Hitler declared it a fortress. But the German troops ignored him and slipped out of the city. Several days later, on April the 10th, Odessa was liberated. Stalin was winning on all fronts. He could now turn his attention to the northern Russian city that had suffered under Nazi assault for years. By the beginning of 1944, the Russian city of Leningrad had been under siege from German forces for nearly 2.5 years. During the first winter, almost 500,000 people had starved to death. Volunteers struggled to put out fires and construct defenses. But by 1944, life in the city had become almost unbearable. Several attempts to relieve it had failed. One effort in 1942 led to the capture of more than 50,000 troops of the Soviet Second Shock Army. Another, in 1943, had enabled a trickle of supplies to get into the city. But even so, throughout 1943, up to 20,000 people continued to die of cold, disease and starvation every month. By January 1944, however, with the Germans in headlong retreat, Stalin now turned his attention to the plight of the city. That month, Soviet forces secretly infiltrated the neighboring peninsula around Oranienburg. The attack on the German positions started with a savage 65-minute bombardment. Then Russian troops ripped into the startled German lines. At the same time, another Soviet force attacked from the northeast around the city. They too burst onto the German lines. For 3 days, the German commander, Field Marshal Georg von Köchler, held out. Finally, he asked Hitler for permission to fall back. Hitler, as always, refused. Köchler argued back, telling the Führer only a swift withdrawal would save his army from a massacre. Hitler sacked him. He was replaced by General Walter Mödel. He was known as Hitler's fireman for his fierce loyalty and avid Nazi outlook. But even to Mödel, the danger was obvious. He now disobeyed Hitler and pulled out. After 2.5 years, the siege of Leningrad was finally lifted. Nearly 1 million Russian civilians had died. Relief in the city was overwhelming. The first fallout was in neighboring pro-German Finland, which now feared a Soviet invasion. So in March 1944, a secret Finnish delegation arrived in Moscow to discuss peace. Stalin's terms were harsh. He demanded the Petsamo region in the far north of Finland, an area rich in nickel, an important ingredient in the manufacture of metal alloys. He also demanded reparations of $600 million. The Finns refused and prepared for a Soviet invasion. But Finland could wait. The Soviet High Command, or Stavka as it was known, had more pressing business further south. The Red Army offensives in the Ukraine in late 1943 had trapped 120,000 German troops in the Crimea. Hitler, as ever, had refused to allow them to withdraw. They now waited helplessly for a Soviet onslaught. In early April, 2 months after the lifting of the siege on Leningrad, it came. The troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front crashed into the Crimea from the north. At the same time, a diversionary attack landed on the eastern end of the peninsula. In less than a day, the Axis troops in the west had given way. They fell back on the port of Sebastopol, and Hitler ordered Fortress Sebastopol to hold out to the last man. They didn't stand a chance. Within 2 weeks of the siege, German troops were being evacuated by sea. 40,000 men escaped, but some 30,000 defenders were still trapped in the port. They retreated to the beaches south of the city, hoping to be rescued by more German ships. It didn't happen. The evacuation was interrupted by a Soviet artillery bombardment. Three days later, the Germans surrendered. Meanwhile, back in the northwest of the country, the Germans still occupied much of what is Belarus today. But the Red Army had grabbed a vast bulge of land stretching into Poland and Romania. It meant the Germans had to defend a 1,400-mile front. They were hugely overextended. Military logic suggested it was time for the Germans to withdraw to more manageable defensive positions. But Hitler, still obsessed with territorial gain, refused to allow any further retreat. The German military would continue to pay a high price for Hitler's constant meddling and unrealistic ambitions. By the spring of 1944, Hitler's forces were stretched to their limit. All along the Eastern Front, there was a desperate need for reinforcements. The problem for the German High Command was where to place the few resources it had to maximum advantage. German intelligence reports suggested the next big Red Army offensive would be into Belarus. But Hitler disagreed. He was convinced Stalin would strike south and seize the Romanian oil fields. Both were wrong, at least to begin with. In the early summer, the Red Army Command finally turned its attention to Finland. Russian troops attacked across the Karelian Isthmus. After 2 days fighting, the Finns were forced to retreat. Slowly, over the next month, the Red Army advanced north into Finland. By August 1944, it was all over, and the Finns sued for peace. It was now that Stalin showed the first signs of a pattern that would be repeated across Europe. He seized land, in this case areas of Finnish Karelia and the nickel-rich Petsamo region. Next, Stalin's attention turned to Central Europe. In the summer of 1944, he launched what he called Operation Bagration, named after a Russian hero of the Napoleonic Wars. At 5 a.m. on June the 22nd, 3 years to the day after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the guns of the Red Army began a ferocious bombardment of German forces in what today is Belarus. It was exactly where, months earlier, German intelligence reports had suggested a Soviet attack would come. But because Hitler had ignored them, the area was poorly defended. It was another of his mistakes. The Germans were now being pounded along a 350-mile front. In some places, the Russians used over 400 guns for every mile. The barrage was followed, as always, by a torrent of Soviet tanks and infantry crashing into the German defenses. To make matters worse for the Germans, they had almost no air support. Much of the Luftwaffe was still tied up defending the German homeland. It was now that Hitler's folly of fighting a war on two fronts became all too apparent. The Red Air Force could operate almost unopposed. Russian planes struck deep behind German lines, cutting communications and harassing reinforcements. Within 36 hours, the German panzers had been swept aside. About 50,000 men faced encirclement in the German-held town of Vitebsk. Hitler, as had become routine, initially refused to let it retreat. Then, when on the following day he relented, it was too late for many of his troops. 4 days later, Vitebsk fell. 20,000 Axis troops were killed and 10,000 taken prisoner. Further south, along the Belarus front, the pattern was repeated. Hitler, now furious, sacked his general, Field Marshal Ernst Busch. Once again, he brought in his favorite, the now promoted Field Marshal Walter Mödel. But it made no difference. Town after town fell. The regional capital of Minsk was now within reach. Two days later, the Red Army encircled it. Over 100,000 German troops were trapped. Soviet forces bombarded. Within a week, the German survivors surrendered. The unstoppable Russian advance now pushed on to the Baltic states. First of all was the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. Across the entire eastern front, the Germans were in retreat. But they left behind them towns and countryside laid waste. They committed widespread atrocities against local inhabitants. Nothing, however, could have prepared the Red Army for what it was about to discover. On July the 23rd, 1944, Soviet forces reached the small Polish village of Majdanek, near Lublin. Here they came across their first evidence of Hitler's final solution: the Majdanek extermination camp. It was a camp designed for the murder of Jews on an industrial scale. But as the first Soviet reports of what they'd found leaked out, the Western Allies simply dismissed them. Three days after seizing Majdanek, the Russians were approaching Warsaw. But here the Red Army paused. Stalin now stood ready to do what Hitler had done before: grab land, not in the name of Lebensraum, but of communism. By the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration had ripped the heart out of the German army in the east. more than 300,000 Axis soldiers had died. A 150,000 had been taken prisoner. The Red Army now paused and dug in along the river Vistula, south of Warsaw. Stalin was in no hurry to bring the war to an end. With Europe in turmoil, conditions were ideal for the spread of communism. The first victims of Stalin's political calculations were the Poles. On August 1st, 1944, the Polish Home Army rose up in Warsaw against its Nazi occupiers. But it desperately needed help. The Red Army, camped just to the south, was perfectly placed to provide it. But Stalin regarded the Polish Home Army as close to the Polish government in exile in London and hostile to communism. So he turned a blind eye to the plight of the Polish fighters. They were crushed with terrible brutality. The Germans wouldn't finally be pushed out of Poland until the Russian army drove them out in January 1945. It was the start of a Soviet master plan that would eventually see communist governments across most of Eastern Europe. To the north, contingents of the Red Army continued to clear the Germans out of the Baltic states. These would later be incorporated into the Soviet Union. Near the Latvian capital of Riga, over 200,000 Germans were trapped behind Russian lines. But Hitler, still determined to hold on to his Lebensraum, refused to countenance a retreat. Even so, gradually the German forces were pushed back to the Baltic coast. By mid-October 1944, the Germans had been squeezed onto the Courland Peninsula, west of Riga. They would remain marooned there for the rest of the war, when they eventually surrendered to Soviet forces. Stalin, meanwhile, was already sizing up other territory in Eastern Europe. He could have moved directly west towards Germany. Instead, units of the Red Army moved south in a vast thrust down through the Balkans. Nearly 1,500 tanks and 1 million men pushed into Romania in late August 1944. The defending Axis forces had less than 400 tanks and just 800,000 troops. Pro-German Romanian troops gave way almost immediately all along the front. 3 days later, large pockets of German troops were surrounded near Kishinev. Hitler issued his standard command: no retreat. For 9 days, there was bitter fighting. Over 180,000 German troops were killed or taken prisoner. The remainder beat a belated retreat. In late August, Romania's pro-German dictator, Marshal Ion Antonescu, was arrested. Romania surrendered. By the end of the month, the Red Army was in Bucharest and had occupied the strategically important Romanian oil fields. It meant Germany had lost its main supply of oil. 3 Soviet armies now moved south into Bulgaria. Bulgaria had tried to stay neutral, but it too would soon be swallowed up by the Soviet Empire. Meanwhile, the rest of the Russian forces now moved west towards Yugoslavia. German troops to the south, in Greece, faced being trapped. They began a hasty retreat up through Albania and southern Yugoslavia. They were harried all the way by Albanian and Yugoslav partisans. By mid-October 1944, the Red Army had reached the Yugoslav capital of Belgrade. Only now did it begin to swing north and west towards Hungary and then Germany. German reinforcements poured into Hungary to support the pro-Nazi puppet government, but the Red Army ground on. Eight weeks later, it laid siege to Budapest. The siege lasted over 6 weeks before the German puppet government collapsed. By the end of 1944, most of Eastern Europe lay in Stalin's grasp. His troops controlled the Baltic states and Poland, Romania and Bulgaria. Pro-Soviet forces ruled in Yugoslavia and Albania. Hungary and Czechoslovakia were in his sights. Stalin had successfully laid the foundations for the future Soviet bloc. He could now, at last, move on to Germany. But in the west, Allied forces were also approaching the German border. The race was on to be the first to take Berlin. 1944, and on the Eastern Front, Hitler's forces were being pushed back towards the German border. But Germany was about to face a new threat. In the West, Allied forces had been preparing for months to open a new front in northwest France. Training for it was well underway. But it was an attack Hitler had long been expecting. His problem was knowing when, and above all where, it would come. The stage was set for one of the greatest battles of World War II, D-Day, the Allied landings along the Normandy coast of France. Since the early years of the war, Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had always been certain that at some point an Allied invasion of Northern Europe would be necessary. The only questions were when, where, and how. To test the waters, British forces had already mounted a number of practice operations. In December 1941, British commandos raided the Vargso Islands off the coast of Nazi-occupied Norway. It was an attempt to probe German defenses and tie down Hitler's troops in the north. A fish oil factory and coastal defenses were blown up before the commandos withdrew. Eight months later, Canadian and British troops were sent in to mount a more ambitious raid on the French port of Dieppe. It too was designed to test the defenses and also to provide combat experience for the Canadians. But this time, it was a catastrophe. As landing craft approached the main beach, they were met by withering fire. Those troops that made it ashore were immediately pinned down. Behind them, the supporting tanks became bogged down in the shingle. Few managed to scale the sea wall. Over 3,000 Allied soldiers were killed or taken prisoner. Britain had learnt an important lesson. Never attempt a direct assault on a German-occupied port. Equally importantly, the Dieppe disaster reinforced the British view that an invasion of Europe could not be rushed. Churchill understood it would require careful planning. Eventually, in April 1943, at an Allied conference in Washington, Churchill and the US President Franklin Roosevelt agreed upon a date. D-Day, or Operation Overlord as the seaborne invasion of France was formally called, would take place in the summer of 1944. But by now, the Germans were preparing for it in earnest. Since the winter of 1941, they had been building an Atlantic wall. It was a massive series of fortifications running along the European coast from Denmark to the Spanish border. gun emplacements had been constructed at likely landing sites. Beaches had been mined and covered in barbed wire. Obstacles had been placed in strategic places to block landing craft. Hitler had boasted, "I am the greatest builder of fortifications of all time." In the summer of 1942, in the wake of the Dieppe attack, work on the Atlantic Wall had been stepped up. Hitler had also ordered an increase in troop numbers in the region. The German overall commander in the west, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had been given 15 further divisions. But the Western European coast stretched for some 2,000 miles. He didn't have the numbers to man the entire length. Von Rundstedt faced a difficult decision. Where should he position his overstretched forces to maximize their effect? The question led to bitter arguments inside the German leadership. Von Rundstedt proposed holding a large force of panzers in reserve northwest of Paris. He could then send it in against an invasion once he knew where it was happening. But the hugely respected Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of the troops covering the sector from Holland along the French coast to the Loire, had a different view. Rommel's concern was Allied air power. He'd seen it firsthand when he'd fought the British in North Africa, and it had left a profound impression. He feared that any counterattack would be broken up by Allied aircraft long before it could go into action. Rommel had also inspected Hitler's Atlantic Wall and found much of it wanting. It had forced him to the conclusion that the best place to position the panzers was as close as possible to the most likely landing sites. That way, an invasion could be immediately pushed back before it got a foothold. Hitler compromised. Rundstedt was given a small force he could hold in reserve, though Hitler himself would have the final say as to when it could be used. The rest of the additional troops was scattered along the entire Atlantic seaboard, in accordance with Rommel's wishes. It would turn out to be the worst of all the solutions. There were neither enough reserves nor enough tanks near the coast. But in the autumn of 1943, none of this was clear. In Britain, the Allied planners were also grappling with the problem of location. Where was the best place to land? Their chief planner, General Frederick Morgan, quickly realized there were two principal options, the Pas-de-Calais and Normandy. The Pas-de-Calais was clearly the favorite. It offered the shortest sea crossing, and it offered the shortest and most direct way to Germany. But it was also the most obvious route, and Morgan was sure the Germans were expecting it. So he decided to wrong-foot them. Morgan would land in Normandy. It was the beginning of a huge gamble on which the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers would depend. In the autumn of 1943, Allied photo reconnaissance aircraft swept over the beaches of northern France. It was part of a huge planning operation for the seaborne invasion of Europe. The fortifications of the Atlantic Wall were monitored by the French resistance. Men crept ashore to collect sand samples to test whether armored vehicles could be landed. Northern France became the most reconnoitered coastline in the history of warfare. It soon became clear any landing would need some kind of port facilities. But the disaster at Dieppe had shown that it was too dangerous to attempt a direct assault on a German-occupied port. Britain's planners were forced to come up with an ingenious alternative. Giant hollow concrete boxes were constructed in Britain that could later be towed to the French coast. There they would be sunk to form an artificial harbour. They were known by their code name, mulberries. The mulberries would be supplied with fuel by a pipeline unwound from giant reels and dropped on the seabed. It would run for 100 miles. The pumping station on the Isle of Wight was disguised as an ice cream parlour. But the raid on Dieppe had also revealed a second problem. How to get the first wave of troops off the beaches and through the German fortifications. The man told to solve that question was General Percy Hobart, one of the pioneers of armoured warfare. Hobart came up with a series of ingenious devices. The troops called them the funnies. They included such extraordinary machines as flamethrowers and floating tanks. Flail tanks for clearing mines. The bobbin for laying firm paths across sand or shingle. An armoured ramp for climbing sea walls. The fascine carrier for tackling ditches. And the bridging tank for wider obstacles. That left just one problem: how to stop the Germans rushing in overwhelming reinforcements before the Allies had established a foothold. The answer was to keep them guessing until the very last moment as to where the invasion would take place. Operation Bodyguard was a massive and complex deception campaign. German double agents in Britain now began sending back to Germany huge amounts of carefully coordinated false information. This emphasized that the main landings would be in the Pas-de-Calais, although a feint attack might be launched in Normandy. To muddy the waters still further, the Allied military created a fictitious army unit, the so-called 1st US Army Group, or FUSAG. It was stationed, very obviously, in Kent, bang opposite the Pas-de-Calais. The man in charge of it was the pistol-toting US General George Patton, who'd been removed from action in Sicily after slapping shell-shocked soldiers. Patton was rated by the Germans as the Allies' best attacking general, just the man they expected to command the invasion of Western Europe.
Basher 5-2, this is Basher 1-1 on Alpha.
Radio transmissions mimicked the wireless traffic of an army. For the benefit of any Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flying over Britain, the fields of Kent were filled with inflatable tanks and carefully faked track marks. There were dummy aircraft made of wood and canvas. Harbors along the Kent coast were filled with dummy landing craft. There were even troops, though these were in reality backup units. In late 1943, the Allies appointed US General Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe. British General Bernard Montgomery would be in overall command of the initial assault troops. D-Day was fixed for June 5, 1944. Two months before the landing, Eisenhower launched an elaborate air offensive to disrupt German links to the coast. Once again, it was carefully planned to give the impression the Allies' target was the Pas-de-Calais region. As the date of the invasion approached, Allied troop numbers in England reached over 2 million. They were supported by more than 3,000 tanks and 12,000 aircraft. The Germans were well aware an invasion was imminent. But they had been completely taken in by the Allies' phony preparations in Kent and were convinced the most likely landing spot was the Pas-de-Calais. Everything seemed to be going the Allies' way. The troops were briefed. Then the weather turned against them. Rain lashed down, visibility was poor, and the channel was stormy. Nevertheless, on June 4th, 1944, the assault troops boarded their landing ships and the armada of more than 5,000 vessels set sail. But the rain continued to lash down, and later that day the invasion had to be postponed. The ships returned to port, and the assault troops faced a nerve-shredding wait. Early the next morning, the military leadership met again. The naval commanders were keen to go ahead. But the air chiefs were doubtful. They worried the visibility would still be too poor to provide effective air support. After a long silence, Eisenhower looked up. "Let's go," he said. Operation Overlord, the greatest seaborne invasion ever, was underway. D-Day had begun. 1:15 in the morning of June the 6th, 1944, British aircraft towing gliders arrived over the coast of northern France. Then the gliders were released and plunged down to capture vital bridges over the Caen Canal in eastern Normandy. The Allies had launched their great gamble to invade Hitler's empire in Western Europe. "50 miles to the west, US paratroops came down around the village of Saint-Mère-Église. There was a fierce firefight. But 3 hours later, the village was in US hands. One of the most crucial battles of World War II was underway. An hour later, horrified German sentries along the Normandy coast saw a vast armada appear out of the mist. They had had no warning. The Allied fleet had sailed under cover of darkness. Moreover, Allied countermeasures had confused the German radar into believing the main weight of the attack was approaching the French coast further east at the Pas-de-Calais. Allied warships off the Normandy coast now began pounding the German defensive positions. Wave after wave of aircraft swept overhead. Under cover of the bombardment, assault troops headed for the shore. But as they closed in, German artillery and machine guns opened fire. A number of the landing craft were hit. Others fell foul of underwater obstructions. But at 6:30 in the morning, the first waves of troops hit the beaches. At the far western end, the US 4th Infantry Division came ashore near at what they called Utah Beach. Within 2 hours, it was linking up with the US paratroopers who'd landed at Saint-Mère-Église. Next door, at Omaha Beach, it was more difficult. The beach was a defender's dream, with high cliffs and few ways inland. As the US 1st Infantry Division waded ashore, they were mown down by German machine guns. To make matters worse, the Americans' amphibious tanks were swamped. The troops were trapped on the beach. Disaster was looming. But finally, a few of the soldiers managed to scale the cliffs. Against all the odds, the Americans hung on to the beachhead. Further east, in the center of the landing area, Britain's 50th Infantry Division came ashore at Gold Beach. They too met savage fire. But now, the British deployed their funnies. The troops were soon moving inland. At the adjoining landing spot, Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division faced a similar situation. Here too, Britain's funnies were vital in helping the troops off the beach. Finally, on the far left flank, at Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division met only patchy resistance. Within hours, its commandos had linked up with the glider-borne troops at the Caen Canal. By early afternoon, the Allies had successfully established all of the beachheads. The timing of the invasion had caught the Germans completely by surprise. They'd expected the Allies to wait until the weather had cleared. Rommel, the operational German commander for the whole of the northwest French coast, had taken the opportunity of bad weather to visit his family in Germany. His immediate subordinate in Normandy and Brittany, General Friedrich Dollmann, was over 100 miles away, taking part in a war game exercise. Only the overall German commander for the whole of Western Europe, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was at his HQ. But he needed Hitler's permission to move his panzer reserves to the battlefield. However, Hitler was asleep, and his aides wouldn't wake him. It wasn't until midday that the Führer finally learnt about the invasion, but he didn't take it seriously. He was still convinced the main attack would come in the Pas-de-Calais. Normandy, he believed, was just a feint. Finally, in the late afternoon, when the scale of the invasion was becoming all too clear, Hitler unleashed his reserves. But they were too far away to provide immediate support. Despite stubborn German resistance, the beachheads around Utah, Gold and Juno and Sword were secure. Only at Omaha was the situation more precarious. Here, German resistance had prevented the US troops moving more than a mile inland. By nightfall on June the 6th, over 100,000 Allied troops had been landed in Normandy. It had been an extraordinary feat of planning, ingenuity, and courage. The first day of the Allies' great gamble had paid off. But it was just the beginning. Now they had to build up, break out, and push on into Europe. As the second day dawned on the greatest seaborne invasion ever attempted, thousands of Allied troops had broken out of their beachheads and were moving inland. But they found the Normandy countryside hard going. The patchwork of woodland and small fields provided ideal terrain for German tanks and machine guns. The Allies suffered heavy casualties. Allied air power provided crucial support. When von Rundstedt's panzer reinforcements arrived, they'd been so depleted by the air attacks that they were unable to mount a major counterattack. The German reinforcements were also hampered by French resistance fighters, operating behind German lines. They ambushed troop convoys and blew up bridges. As a result, the Das Reich SS Panzer Division took over 2 weeks to make a journey which should have lasted a mere 3 days. Its troops took out their fury on the French civilian population. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane and its 642 inhabitants were wiped out. After 4 days of fighting, all the Allied beachheads were finally able to link up. But they'd still only managed to penetrate 10 miles inland. Eventually, 6 days after the landing, the British commander, General Montgomery, launched a major assault on the strategically important town of Caen. The British 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, advanced. But its spearhead ran into 4 German Tiger tanks. The Allies' Sherman tanks were completely outclassed. Their guns were outranged and their shells unable to penetrate the German armor. They were particularly vulnerable because many ran on petrol fuel and were liable to burst into flames when hit. The Germans nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, or more macabrely, the Tommy Cooker. In less than 5 minutes, more than 10 British tanks were destroyed. The attack on Caen stalled. Outmatched by the German tanks, the Allies relied on air power and artillery. But it wasn't enough. The Desert Rats retreated. Caen remained in German hands. Meanwhile, further west, US forces advanced on the equally important port of Cherbourg. It would take them nearly 10 days to get close to it. They weren't helped by the weather. During the first week of the invasion, it had been relatively calm, and supplies and reinforcements had poured in through the Mulberry artificial harbours. But now the weather turned. Gales swept the English Channel. The US Mulberry Harbour at Omaha was destroyed. The other Mulberry, in the British sector, was badly damaged and put out of action for several days. The flow of reinforcements slowed. It meant the port of Cherbourg was an even more vital objective. As the US forces now approached it, the German garrison resisted. There was fierce house-to-house fighting. It would take the Allies a week to secure the city. But the port had been trashed by the fleeing Germans. It would take a further month before it could be brought back into service. Meanwhile, Montgomery launched another assault on Caen. But the storms had turned the fields into a sea of mud. Low cloud meant air support was impossible. To make matters worse, the newly arrived elite German 2nd SS Panzer Corps was thrown into the defense of the city. After 4 days, the British were again forced to halt. Then, as the clouds cleared, nearly 500 Allied bombers devastated Caen. British troops fought their way into the north suburbs. But the ruins made ideal defensive positions for the Germans. Allied casualties mounted. After 48 hours, the attack was, yet again, called off. Three weeks later, Montgomery tried for a fourth time. The plan was to capture the remaining German strongholds and then push on south, deeper into France. After 2 more days of fighting, the city was finally won. The way now seemed open for the British tanks to move south, deeper into France. But the Germans were waiting with a large force of panzers. The British advance stopped again. The Americans in the west, however, were having an easier time. The fighting around Caen had sucked in the majority of the German defenders. As the American forces prepared to thrust further into France, they faced only scattered opposition. The scene was set for the Allied forces to break out at last. At 9:30 in the morning of July the 25th, 1944, over 1,800 Allied aircraft carpet-bombed a 4-mile stretch of the German front line south of Cherbourg. It was the beginning of Operation Cobra, the US breakout into France. The German defenders were stunned by the size of the assault. But so too were some of the US soldiers. The plan had been for the bombers to fly in from the east, parallel to the US front line, to minimize the risk of bombing American troops. But most of the aircraft came in over the top of the US lines. Bombs fell short. Over 100 US troops were hit and killed. Yet despite the ferocity of the bombardment, when the US forces later picked themselves up and moved forward, they found to their astonishment substantial numbers of German troops had survived. The survivors mounted a stubborn resistance. As fighting raged, it looked as though the Americans would fail to break through the German lines. But then, the German defenses crumbled. The next morning, US tanks broke through and moved forward into open country. There was now almost no German resistance left, and the Americans quickly pushed deeper into France. The hill town of Coutances fell. Then the crossroads town of Avranches. As the Allies pressed forward, they were helped by change and confusion in the German high command. At the beginning of July, 3 weeks after the D-Day landings, Hitler dismissed the German commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, for defeatism. Von Rundstedt had made little attempt to hide his belief that Germany faced an unwinnable struggle. He was replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, fresh from the Eastern Front, but with little knowledge of northwestern France. Two weeks later, Rommel, the second most senior German officer on the front, was severely injured when his staff car was strafed by a British fighter. Then, with the Nazi command already in confusion, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler's life. On July the 20th, 1944, a disillusioned aristocratic war hero, Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, planted a bomb in the planning hut at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Four officers were killed. But Hitler was sheltered by a heavy, solid oak conference table and escaped with only minor injuries. The plot was swiftly and brutally put down. Von Stauffenberg was shot and his principal collaborators put on trial. They would later be hanged. Hitler put a brave face on it and visited some of the wounded in hospital. But it hardened still further his distrust of his senior officers. He would, despite his many earlier misjudgments, demand even greater control over events on the battlefield. Back in France, General George Patton, back in charge of a real fighting force, ordered his troops to fan out. They took Rennes, Mayenne, and headed for Le Mans. They were now moving round behind the German forces, still battling it out with the British and Canadians near Caen. With the Americans to their south and the British to their north, it seemed the German forces in Normandy would be surrounded. Hitler issued his usual order that there should be no retreat, but as the Allies squeezed in on them, the Germans began to flee. They were remorselessly harried by Allied aircraft and artillery. The casualties were appalling. Finally, on August the 20th, 1944, the Allied forces moving in from both the north and south met up. The so-called Falaise Gap, named after the nearby French village, had been closed. Large numbers of Germans were trapped. Over 10,000 more Germans, caught in the Allied pincer, died. A further 50,000 were taken prisoner. The German army in Western Europe was in chaos. Meanwhile, far to the south, on the French Mediterranean coast near Cannes, there was a second Allied seaborne invasion. US troops came ashore virtually unopposed. They were helped by paratroopers from the Free French Army, men who had escaped from German-occupied French territory in Europe and North Africa. The landing had always been opposed by the British, who regarded it as a diversion. But the United States had long regarded it as an essential part of clearing the Germans out of France. The troops were greeted by an ecstatic civilian population. It was soon advancing rapidly up the Rhone Valley. Lyon was liberated on September the 3rd, 1944. Ten days later, they reached Dijon and made contact with Patton's forces advancing from western France. German units stationed across the region fled. In barely 3 weeks of headlong advance, the Allied invasion of Europe had liberated most of France. That left Paris, where French resistance fighters now rose up against the German occupation. There seemed little to prevent the Allied onrush from continuing to the German border.